I'm Rich Miller. I wrote a few books. I try to get you the truth about Split Rock. Now tonight we're doing World War I. You won't hear about the explosion until next month, but you'll actually hear about the 1916 explosion tonight. And pardon me, this is the first time I've done this program, maybe even the last. I don't know who else wants to hear about this stuff. We'll see. Now, Split Rock, and I have a score which I have not language. I'll just wing it anyway. Split Rock was run by Seventh Solvay, and you're probably not familiar with this company, but it was also associated with Solvay Process. The same officers for Solvay Process were serving on the board for Seventh Solvay. Seventh Solvay was a Belgian company, just like Solvay Process was. They came up with a novel idea of making chemicals. Now what they did is they invented the Seventh Solvay byproduct coke oven. Coke was used in the steel industry. Basically what they do is they heat coal, they by heating it, they remove the impurities, they come up with a high carbon content, which is used in the steel industry. Well, what Seventh Solvay Belgium found out, you're wasting all this gas that's going up the flue, which is also poisonous. So they were into like an environment back then. So what they came up with was this oven, and the first one in the United States was built over here in Solvay, the village of Solvay, and it was many of them were built after that, both for Solvay, and they built them for other factories. Basically, they wanted as many as they could, because what they were doing is they're still making the coke by heating the coal, and it came out in this cart, but up this flume, all this gaseous material is put into another area, which creates these light oils that are going to be used in the chemical industry. Now this is the coal tar tree. It's not a real tree, but what it is a idea of what they use those byproduct oils for, the things that were normally being expelled into the atmosphere. Of course, you have coal, tar. You would think these are normal things you would get out of coal, pitch, things like that. But what they also could derive out of the coal, you go up the thing, here's up the limbs here, and there's phenol, and you go up here, and you can make dyestuffs out of it. You can make picric acid, which was another high explosive. But over here on another branch, you have salicylic aspirin, and it goes acid, and it goes up to be aspirin. Likewise, out of the coal, you could take out toluene, you could make TNT, or you could make dyestuffs, or you go up here and you could make saccharin, which is a familiar thing today. But a lot of these products all come from those waste products that came out of burning the coal. And you have all kinds of explosives, different branches. You have all kinds of dyestuffs, indigo, you name it. Everything we have today comes out of coal. All the what they used to call the pharmaceutical, the coal tar pharmaceuticals. Aspirin was a big product during World War I. It was so big that we actually used World War I to steal it from the Germans. Bayer used to be a German firm, and under the Wartime Act, what they did is they confiscated it, and they created Bayer of the United States. So it's, we stole it fair and square. Now, a lot of you might not even know where Split Rock is. This gives you an idea. Here's Fairmont Corners, West Genesee Street, Onondaga Road, and if you're going down Onondaga Boulevard, it dead ends here. That used to be the old trolley line, and this is the Split Rock Gulf. It was divided in two parts. You have the American side down here, where all the factories were located, and then you have Canada Hill, which is mainly claimed to be storage, but there's other things going on here, which you'll see later on. And you have Powder Road leading up through the area right up to Genesee Street, and they would take TNT up Powder Road to Fairmont Station, which exists about where that red dot is, and they would load that onto trains. And we'll see more of what they did here, but you have Onondaga Road, you have Split Rock Road, And basically, this continues all the way to Casson Road, which is over here. So when I speak of Canada, it's Canada Hill. It's not Canada. Once I was explaining to somebody, the fire crept towards Canada, and they thought the country. So it's very important we describe that now. Now, a lot of people think the explosives came during World War I. This is actually a 1908 photograph. What we do know about Split Rock is they started making TNT up there in 1900. By 1907, they moved their picric acid plant from Solvay process along Milton Ave up to Split Rock to put it in a more isolated spot, more so to keep Pantons away from competitors, so they wouldn't know how the process was being done. Because throughout the whole history of Split Rock, they've learned quicker and better ways to make high explosives, both picric acid and TNT. And those products were used mostly in military preparation, even though after the war, TNT and picric acid become used for stumps and road building and all that. Mainly the picric acid was used by the Allies, as we were still calling them even before we joined World War I. And those Allies were France, Italy, and England. And there's also the Russians, Imperial Russia wanted a contract. The company said, well, we'll try to make it. We're not even sure if Imperial Russia ever got any of their shipments. But you can see here's the quarry. There's a Manhattan engine from the Manhattan Elevator Railroad. They're actually quarrying here. This picture is about 1908. And then back here is a building. And this would be along Small Road. And to give you an idea of the building, here's a close-up of it. There's no way they needed a building like this for quarry operation. And you'll see these little blocks here, that's brick. Basically, if there's an explosion in one of these explosive factories, and again, we don't know if this is picric acid, ammonia, picrit, or TNT, but the idea is if there's an explosion, the blast will go out through one of these walls to dissipate the effect. It's not there to protect the men, it's there to protect the machinery. The men get, as you'll see in the 1916 explosion, the men get hurled through the walls, but the machinery stays in place. That's the important thing. Men you can replace, machinery is very expensive. I mean, it's capitalism. I mean, this is what America's about here. Now, I said 1907, they moved their picric acid plant from Solvay, the village of Solvay, to Split Rock. 1915, they start full scale on TNT production. And here you have TNT number 1. This is the building that in 1918 will be the focus of the events that night. You have what was the old stone crusher here, base. Above this used to be a 3-story building. And this quarry operation ended in 1911, just before Split Rock really got developed as a explosive factory. And you see, the plant's not in operation. You have a car, it's not covered here. A lot of people can afford cars. I mean, people actually in their first paycheck bought cars, cash. They bought a car, they put a down payment on a house, and they usually bought like Liberty bonds. And then you see the TNT building. Now, this above it is not a smokestack. That's what they call an emergency gravity water tank. In case of explosion, the water power is cut off from the Gulf, where there's a pumping station. This facility here would provide water for firefighting. You also see back here is a guard tower with you can barely see it, a little searchlight on it. And those guards, at least until the Army went over to Europe, those guards were armed with fully automatic machine guns, 30 caliber machine guns. They weren't going to mess around with their factory. And this building probably in the back is a nitric acid factory. There's really not too much detail on a lot of these buildings. But one thing you look at, and you look at this, how many stories would you think this building was? Like more than one? It's a 1-story building. The company convinced the state and fire inspectors that this was a 1-story building, even though you see levels here, you see levels here. And because it's a one-story building, it's not required to have sprinklers. So, you know, that leads into, you know, the drastic events of July 2nd, 1918. But yeah, that's a one-story building, and the company convinced the state fire inspectors that these upper floors were really not complete floors, they were just toe boards and platforms. But I think the state didn't have any idea that men were working up in those areas. So that starts to get you into the next presentation next month. This is another view of it. I think this is just a hole in the negative. But now you see the plant's in operation. You can see the cars are covered because of the pollution. I mean, it would eat away paint. I mean, people were told not to hang their washout, you know, during the day. And so this picture is a little later than the other one. You see TNT number 1, which was built in 1915. This could be TNT number 2. It was a different building than the first one. And then there's no building over here. TNT number 3 gets built after the 1916 explosion. And then you look way in the back, and these are the interesting things. You look way in the back, and you see these tall pipes. And it's hard to judge just where those things are, but more than likely that's down by Small Road, and that could be part of what they call a nitrogen fixation process. And the smoke coming out might not be smoke, it just might be fumes from their operation. But this here is probably the cafeteria restaurant. It's hard to tell because when you look at some of these pictures, the buildings are so cramped together. When you look at when you get to the explosion, look at some of the hand-drawn maps, they're very basically drawn, and it's very difficult to tell what these buildings are.
Rich, did you ever connect those towers in the back right there to the building on Small Road?
No, you'll see it in some nice sites. You'll see a lot of foundations back there. This apparently is where Tripoli landfill is. Tripoli landfill now exists, but it's all conjecture because when you look at a photo like this, you can't tell scale, you can't tell distance, you only can tell an approximate angle, and that would be pretty close to, you know, pretty much where Small Road and Split Rock Road come together. But without a real map, which we don't have, it's very difficult to describe. What happens in February of 1916, February 18th, 1916, this is the TNT plant number 2, which was just completed. What happens is they get you know, they're just starting their TNT operation. They say any 3-year college student of chemistry could run the plant. So what do? They get a 2-year college chemistry student to run the plant. He gets the bright idea to double the production in Split Rock, and he doubles the batches. Well, the one thing they don't anticipate is a chemical reaction creates a lot of fumes and a lot of back pressure. So what happens is you have an explosion, but explosion in the sense that you have a tank blowing up under pressure. And the idea of the brick walls, 5 men are thrown through the brick walls. 2 die a little bit later. I think 1 dies on the way to hospital. 1 dies, the one that ran the factory dies a couple of days later. There's really no mystery to it. They were just trying to speed up production, and things got out of hand. Now, the terrible thing about this, it happened in February. You can see, like, probably is still on the ground. They didn't have really any way of getting the men out of there. It was the middle of winter. They had a double time. It took hours to get them to the hospital, and there was really no there was no use helping them. But unfortunately, one of the men, it was his first night there. Another man had been working there 2 weeks. The man who ran the factory, I think, he was working there a few months. So that's an event that usually gets forgotten. And then by the December of 1916, they built the 3rd TNT plant. Now, also up at Split Rock are picric acid plants. Picric acid is another high explosive used by the Europeans. The American Army tended to use TNT for their high explosives, artillery shells, hand grenades, that kind of thing. Now, we don't have any real pictures of the picric acid plant, but this was a drawing based on one of the plants up at Split Rock. this fellow, his last name was Stevens, he went around saying, I can build you a plant just like they have in Split Rock, just give me the money. And apparently he sent it to every library in their state, because SU Library has them, Rochester Library has them. But this gives you just an idea what the buildings look like with a ventilator roof. And then there's an addition for the power plant. They keep it separate from the picric acid. To tell you, they weren't worried about fires, and that might be one reason they didn't really want to get into an expensive sprinkler system. Like every chemist knows, and this came out with the 1916 explosion, is every chemist knows fire cannot cause TNT or picric acid to explode. So, so they weren't worried about fire. The only thing they were worried about fire is if it got beyond the confines of one room, the plants were made of wood, and the wood was saturated with chemicals, and it burned like gasoline. That's why when we do the split rock explosion, why it's so ferocious to try to put out the fire, because they're actually working in a furnace. But anyway, this gives you an idea. And if you want to see one of these buildings, at least the exterior of them, you go down to James Street and Thompson Road, and there's the old, what's the factory I'm trying to think of, down by the railroad tracks? It used to be Hoffman's, I'm not sure what it is now. But they took apart 3 of these buildings and moved them down to James Street and Thompson Road. One of them they tore down in the 50s, but 2 of them are still there. So as you drive down Thompson Road and you want to, just look off in the Gulf there, just behind the burned area, you'll see 2 of these factories still exist.
They were getting their nitrates out of that, right?
This,
When it was down at Thompson Road.
well, no, actually they moved these down to Thompson Road to have chickens in them. They had an egg farm, Vesca egg farm. So they raised chickens in here. And what's funny about those buildings down there, in World War II, they actually made shell casings for the military. So they had artillery shell casings. So these buildings were used 1 and 2. Now, another thing at Split Rock, and nobody realizes this is a typical chloropicrin factory, or sometimes it's called chloropicrin factory. Definitely at Split Rock in World War I, they made poison gas. And this is an example of what one of those buildings looks like. And from the outside, when you look at photographs, you can't tell because it has the same ventilator roof with the windows, so you can't really tell that building from any other one. But there's definite proof they made poison gas. How much, it's not known. And where they stored it was probably Canada Hill, or an area just north of Canada Hill. But we didn't use poison gas in World War I, even though we didn't sign the Hague Peace Treaty. Most of what they made, or all of what they made in poison gas up at Split Rock, probably was stored there throughout the whole war. It never left the site. So that's another cause for concern, because poison gas will not explode under fire, but it's in tanks. Just like a water heater in your house, you heat those tanks and they'll burst. And if you destroy or put a hole in those tanks, you're going to have a gas cloud over Syracuse. So that's the concern here. It's not the fire, it's the escape of the chemicals. Now this gets a little more complicated. The thing about Split Rock, the thing that really is so important about Split Rock is this little diagram. This is called ammonia oxidation, or a converter for ammonia oxidation. Basically what they do is they put ammonia on one side, it goes through this platinum gauze, and out comes nitric oxide, and then they send it through a series of towers, which have these little ceramic rings, they call them tower packing rings, and that mixed in with soda ash, which would come from solid process, creates nitric acid. And the whole thing about TNT and picric acid is nitric acid makes them explosive. Picric acid is trinitrophenol. TNT is trinitrotoluene. And without the nitric acid, you can't have an explosive. And if you don't have an explosive, you sure enough don't have a war. You have a big, big problem. So it was actually developed at Split Rock. There's a whole article about it. It was developed at Split Rock perfected at Split Rock. And here you actually see what they call converter number 4. And this might not mean anything, but at the Historic Society here, they have lab reports on converter number 4. This is actually a photograph of the first one they built up at Split Rock. It's just a metal container inside platinum gauze, which they borrowed from the federal government. They borrowed $6 million of platinum gauze. I mean, that's when a million was a lot of money. And they developed this, and once they got it perfected, then they developed it, they actually produced a production plant, which would have looked something like this. Again, another ventilator roof. This was probably, as you'll see, was probably over on Small Road. Here's Small, well, here's Small Road. This is probably what they call nitrogen fixation and ammonia oxidation.
It's on that side.
Nitrogen fixation actually took common air and withdrew nitrogen, one element of, or atom of nitrogen for every 3 atoms of hydrogen. That produces ammonia. Once you have ammonia, you can produce nitric acid through that converter. Before this, if they wanted nitric acid to make TNT or picric acid, they would buy tank cars of nitric acid from other concerns across the United States. But nitric acid was also produced from extracting ammonia through the cyanamide process, which was another process that was being run over Niagara Falls by American Cyanamide Corporation. And if you don't know American Cyanamide, they make pine salt today. And the other nice thing about American Cyanamide, it's a Canadian company. It's not American. It's over by the Niagara Falls area. So prior to this, any nitric acid they want, they would have to export from Chile. They have to bring the sodium nitrate off Chile through ships, run any kind of danger from German submarines, bring it up to Split Rock, and then produce nitric acid, or use the cyanamide process, buy nitric acid from various companies and run it in by tank car. Now, what you can't see on this, this is a 1938 photograph. It's the closest thing we have to a map. But what they would do up here would be, solving process. They would run the tank cars down Milton Ave to Martisco Station, then south to Marcellus, and there they would connect at Marcellus Park with the Auburn and Syracuse Electric Railway. Then they would run up through the trolley line through this area off here at Casson Road. At Casson Road, the trolley line continued through the Gulf, whereas there was a spur that ran directly into Split Rock, so they could bring in the nitric acid cars in that way. And as many as 40 cars would be waiting down at Marcellus Park to be brought into Split Rock. But the problem with Split Rock is, it was nice when they first started, but now they're isolated, which is good because they're working on these processes down here are top secret processes, but now they're so isolated they can't get supplies in very easily. So they're running in the tank cars at night, the trolley's running during the day. But the other problem with Split Rock is getting the materials out. We do know there was a dry bridge here. They would take TNT across this dry bridge past the superintendent's house, and they'd take it over to an area here they call the drying plant. And there they would actually dry the TNT for shipment. They would store it in these little bunkers up here, and they weren't really storage bunkers in the sense of what the Army has. They put it in the bunker, next day they ship it out, next day they bring more in. They kept moving the material out. And what they would do is they would take it down Powder Road to West Tennessee Street and over to Fairmont Station, which is Milton and Onondaga Road there. But this wasn't the only drying plant. Picric acid, which was here, and then up in here, there were 6 picric acid factories, plus they added another one behind TNT at some point. That was picric acid number 3. They also produce, the high explosives. It's unsure how they got that material out. It was in a liquid state. They could have pumped it or transported it across Canada Hill, but this drying plant was for TNT. You couldn't mix the two together. So there was another area, and what comes up is this area that's in the newspaper after the war called Yellowstone. Now, Yellowstone was somewhere to the north of Canada Hill. In fact, when you're reading about the explosion, they talk about, the fire trying to get across the Gulf, and they're worried about it getting into the storage facilities. Well, yeah, there was storage all along the hill, but there's no room for picric acid. What they had to have is another drying plant, which they built. There's records that they built a second drying plant, which is nowhere on this property. It was somewhere in this area where it's now developed. Well, when you look at these roads, and this is not as good as the other map I had on, you see these parallel roads, and some of them are overgrown. Well, this is very indicative of an explosive storage facility. And if you look close, and you can't really see it here, there are berms lining these squares. So you have only berms to protect the population from explosions. So this area, even though it was developed in the 1930s, had to be developed on an existing storage facility. And the reason it got, excuse me, the reason it got called Yellowstone was they hired 18 girls to do the packing. And the reason they did that was the men were at war, so girls were more available, and they called themselves Yellowstone girls because the picric acid turned their skin yellow. And other places, they call them canaries. The general term is powder girls. But they were guaranteed work at Summit Salve as long as they were able to work. Of course, the war ends, and the company kicks them out. They get rid of all the workers here, and they bring back their old workers who come back from the war. But they had the most hazardous job working in these factories to do the packing. That's where the most danger was. It wasn't fire, it wasn't static electricity. What it was iron oxides. If anything, as much as a pinhead of a nail touched the picric acid dust, the whole building would blow up, because the whole building was covered with dust from the packing of this material. And so they had to be very careful to wear shoes without nails in them. There's stories of other factories where they have a plumbing leak, plumber comes in, and all he does is touch the wrench to the pipe, and it comes in contact with picric acid dust, and then the whole plant just blew up. So it was very unstable for that, but otherwise, it was safe from fire. It was, except for these poor girls who are nailing down, not quite nailing down these wooden crates, but hammering down with, rubber mallets, and then it was shipped out some way, and it's unknown how they really shipped it out. It might have been taken by a train, because another thing is, it's confusing. There's always these little sketches about split rock. Apparently, a railroad ran through here. Summit Salve and Salve Process actually bought up all this area because they wanted to run a railroad across West Genesee Street to carry the explosives out, because they were having a hard time, getting things out through the trolley line. And they couldn't go out this way through the trolley line because they would go through Syracuse. And Syracuse got kind of concerned about explosives after 1841 when the powder factory blew up on Willow Street. So they didn't want any explosives coming out. So they were planning on a railroad. They bought all this property in 1916. But these people, they had farms, like there's a farm right in here. These people didn't want a railroad of explosive material running in the backyard. So it's unsure what they did, but apparently from articles that appear after the war, apparently what they did is they built a railroad back to Marcellus Station, which is, through here. And somewhere along this line, DuPont built a dynamite factory. And they stored all their dynamite at this facility up in this area. So it's very sketchy. The only other thing is, DuPont was running out some dynamite through the city. They ran into the nearest intersection, which was Fairmont Corners, which is just up in here. The guy who was supposed to arrive to split up the load didn't, so the driver drove the whole load down through the city. And there was a warning out for him, so down at the Lackawanna freight station, the police were waiting for him. They were very carefully hidden behind boxes. So when he drove up, they arrested him for carrying explosives through Syracuse. So we know approximately where Yellowstone is, and like I said, this is the only area that's flat enough to really match the description. And when you read about the fire and during the explosion, how they were worried it would get to the storage facilities, they describe it as a series of rolling hills. Well, this area is one hill. This area down here is rolling hills. So this has to be where the main picric acid storage was, which also means this is also where they would have stored the poison gas. So it's right on the top of Fairmount Corners. And then you have other things on this slide. You'll see more through the lecture on the quarry. There's a clubhouse, the superintendent's house is here. They built company houses for the men. They also had company barracks up here, which were there from the quarry days. They actually used this in 1915 for children. They had a diphtheria epidemic and they put them all up here, which was pretty safe because basically they were just starting to build this area down here with the factories. Also, this area down in here they wanted to use for a tuberculosis sanitarium in 1913, but they actually ended up moving up here on Onondaga Hill. And of all things, in 1914, when these factories were just getting started, right in here, in two of the company houses, they actually converted them to a fresh air nursery for little children, for the children of parents who were working somewhere in the neighborhood. So this was actually a fresh air camp, but as you see later on, they wouldn't even hang their wash out there during the days of the quarry. And then there's other things. They tried to save everything of the acid. The acid was very expensive, not expensive, but it was profitable. So they had an acid recovery building, they had nitric acid buildings to convert the ammonia to nitric acid. And then these are old quarry names. Excuse me, they're on here for reference. These you'll see in the quarry. The quarries are all closed down by this time. There's Dagan, there's Filer, Letty, Crowley, and then there was the Shanahan quarry. But these just give you reference to what's there now. And of course the factories are gone. All you see now are foundations, but these quarries are still in place. I'll come back to the map. This gives you an idea of the actual buildings. What we're looking at is from the front gate. And this picture was actually taken right after the explosion. So some of the buildings I'll show you in the next slide. But you see, everybody has cars. They're very well paid. At least the foremen are, not maybe the average worker. Here's a building that's becomes an administration building. But what's always interesting are the buildings in the background. This is actually their huge nitric acid factory. And up here, again, they have one of these water towers for emergency water fighting, or for emergency water for fighting fires. This dark building is the acid recovery, because basically before they threw away the acids, they tried to glean as much of the chemicals they could, because basically they could produce like TNT, I'll say like 15 cents a pound, but they could sell for $1.50. And we'll see the numbers later on how much they were making. They also had a train shed up here. This might be the train shed because they had to bring engines in to bring in the tank cars. They had to service them. And then you look at the next slide, and this is before the explosion. You see, this is the main gate. It's a turnstile where the men had to come through, show their ID cards. Behind it, there's offices. The Split Rock police were back here. This building survives. I think this might be the carpenter shop. This building back here is the laboratory. This building probably is the restaurant. And then you just see smokestack. These smokestacks are to the boiler house. They had the boiler house down in the Gulf. And trolley line ran through here. And you also see guard shacks. There's one there, there's one here, and if you had a blow up, there's actually some back in here. So guards were stationed at every building, and then they had patrolmen that went through the factory. They had our actual route they would take, and the patrolmen were actually also the firemen in case of fires. Now this was actually taken during a Flag Day presentation in 1917, and here's a, you can't see it very well, but here's a wagon full of high explosives on its way to Canada, right in the middle of a crowd, because it is actually safe. You just don't want to walk on it with shoes. You just don't want to light it because it will burn. You'll ruin a nice wagon, and you don't want to smell the output because you see all these, you can't see them very well, but there's a lot of smokestacks back here that are producing a lot of pollution. This is another view from that same time period. You can see the boiler stand sticking out. The boiler is down below. That's where they get their power to man the pumps. I mean, all the water was under pressure by steam. Steam would also produce electricity, so they had a stationary engineer. But in the background, I don't know what these buildings are, but it's funny, right in between, there's another of those emergency gravity water tanks. That's to fight fires up on Canada Hill. And if you know the property, it sits about right behind, I hope he's not here, Mr. Gasparini's house. Anyway, you can still see the foundation back there. It's just, all you'll see now is 4 concrete posts in the ground. There used to be a pipe that would stick out, but that's for water, it's not chemical. And that would also supply water in case there was a fire down in the Split Rock Village. This is another view taken right after the explosion, but it's showing Canada Hill. And I just saw some nice blow-ups of that. This gentleman here put some on the table. You can see this a lot better. But this is what they call the drying plant. They referred to Canada Hill as Little Canada or Dry Canada. And the reason was because of this drying plant. Now down below in this lower structure, and you can still see it today, are 4 square holes. That was for the machinery to run centrifuges. There are 5 of them. They actually spun the TNT to dry it because dry TNT you can ship more, obviously. If you remove the moisture content, you can ship more. It's cost effective. They used to do the same for picric acid. We don't have a photograph of the picric acid factory, but it would pretty much be the same thing. The thing about picric acid, it was so safe to ship liquid. It was almost like in a toothpaste form. Dry, it's where it became a problem. If it came in contact with any kind of iron element, it would explode. In the wet state, it wouldn't explode. But the company was the only company in the United States that would ship picric acid wet. I'm not sure the railroad companies do that or not, because they wanted it, I mean, some of it's how they shipped it dry. The railroad companies wanted to ship wet because they didn't want any danger of explosives. And there's other buildings back here, like a powerhouse, nondescript buildings, telephone poles. There's a wire fence that runs around the perimeter. And actually in that photograph, you can't see it, some gentleman was pointing out, that's a watchtower right there, which is the same as this one right here. Until tonight, I hadn't seen that photograph. There were 8 of these watchtowers around with big searchlights on them, all manned by automatic machine guns. The whole area was surrounded by a perimeter fence. Now, to give you an idea, the state property, when they sold it in 1922, had a 9-mile perimeter fence around it. But Split Rock, when they were building were thinking of building a sanitarium down below, was 500 acres. Plus, in 1916, they added at least another 100 acres north of Canada Hill. So you got to imagine the perimeter fence around here, around this whole factory, was probably in the neighborhood of 50 miles. But there was 9 miles known to exist right around the what they call the American side, or where the TNT and picric acid factories were. Funny thing about these guard towers, the children in the neighborhood, for want of not having any other entertainment, would make a dummy up. They would, make a nice mannequin up, stuff it full of straw, throw it up on the perimeter fence, and yell, hey, somebody's trying to get in there. And so the watchtowers would all focus on the man, the machine guns would fire on him, and it'd be a dummy. It was a routine, unloving kind of a thing to do. What else do you do when you go up there? Now, this is just an idea of what the patrolmen look like. They're all hired by the company. There were at least 300 of them. This shows them with their Winchester rifles. If you look in the Historic Society, they also had 32 caliber pistols on them. This is Chief Horton over here. The best thing I could say about him was, and I can't use those words, but one of the guys they interviewed said, you didn't want to get on his bad side, I guess, basically. He was a taskmaster. He ran that factory just as any military camp, and that's one reason we didn't have the trouble we would have in other factories in the United States and Canada with things blowing up. So you have the crew here, and there's Canada Hill, and there you can barely see it as the quarry superintendent's house from the old quarry days. That was built in 1892. And what it was used for in World War I, nobody knows, but right after World War I, a couple sisters and their blind brother bought that and lived in there until there was a fire there in 1965. But this gives you a typical idea of the crew. And you look at them.
Rich,
What?
is that the house that was up by Ottman?
Yeah, that's the old Ottman estate. Gladys Ottman actually signed a deal with Salve Process, yeah. And when you come to the quarry lecture, you'll actually see better pictures of that. But yeah, you can see none of these men are very young. The men were off at the war. Everybody who worked at Split Rock was usually old age, over 50, after draft age, or they were young. A lot of the workmen were 13, 14 years old. One guy I interviewed, he was a foreman. He was 16 years old. He had 38 men under him. So those are the kind of people running the factory.
Rich,
What?
my great-grandfather's at the center back there.
Oh, where? This one?
Up above him,
This-
right there, yeah.
What's his
He
name?
was Ben Webster. He was born about 1858, so he was older.
Oh, what?
He also worked in the quarry.
Oh, okay. I didn't know that. See, I learned stuff.
Well, I think he did years ago.
If Rich
but
doesn't
we
know
were
something,
lucky.
that's
Oh, okay. Just sort of talk to me.
Wow.
I don't know
I
what
didn't
kind of
know
car
that.
this
It's
is.
good.
I wish you would step away. And of course, they have their badges on, hats. Now, even though they had 300 policemen up there, they also hired Pinkerton men, and 2 of them will die in the explosion. And that adds to confusion because they're in uniform, but nobody knows who they are.
We had Pinkerton buttons.
Now just to give you an idea, those men were standing near the main gate. The main gate was here. And I show this again because they're bringing in supplies through Castle Road. There's a spur that comes off, goes into Split Rock. That's how the nitric acids, sulfuric acids are supposed to come in that way. But what happens in May of 1918, they're using old equipment. I mean, you don't want to use your best equipment to bring a nice engine into a factory where the acid's going to eat it away. So they're bringing in May 24th, 1918, they're bringing in a load of two hopper cars. One's limestone and one's coal. Coal's obviously for the boiler house, which is down by the main gate in the Gulf, and the other is probably ballast for railroad beds, because this is all crisscrossed with railroad beds, and you can still see where they are today. But what happens is, the men, they're not engineers, and one is actually the superintendent of freight on the Auburn and Syracuse Electric Railroad. And what they do is they miss the switch, and they end up on what's called Olney Point up in here. And being not acquainted what to do, there's different stories of what happened. Some say they abandoned the train. Some say they were trying to get help, but instead of like running alongside the train and going back to light a flare, they were crawling over the cars, to try to get to the end of the train. It was only a freight trolley, which is this. This is called Long Tom. This was hauling the freight cars, and they had 2 cars behind it. So the men were running this, and they said, "Oh my God, we missed the switch. There's a trolley, passenger trolley, coming up behind us." And they were doing like 60 miles an hour. So the man runs, and he starts climbing over one car and then the other. Well, by that time, the trolley hits. Now, why he didn't just, he's on this, why he doesn't just jump off and run along the tracks, nobody knows. And this is when they first bought the car, and I'm not sure if this is it. But this car was furnished with 2 whistles on it. These whistles could be heard for 2 miles. In other words, if they had a problem with this trolley, they could blow these whistles, and that freight trolley could warn the passenger trolley all the way back to Marcellus Station. They didn't blow the whistles. The guy's running with a flag to try to flag down the trolley, which is coming at 60 miles an hour around the blind curve, when all they had to do was blow these whistles. Why they do that, I don't know. The other thing is, one guy on the train says there was no freight trolley there. The cars were left vacant. The men who ran the trolley realized it was an accident, disconnected, took the trolley away. And so you have that version. And the one guy says, "I think they left those cars there on purpose." And why this accident happened is actually more a mystery than the explosion in 1918.
What happened was, Long Tom is basically nothing more than a motorized flat car.
Right.
It has no weight to it for traction, so it didn't have the.
Right,
weight
it can't
to
back,
push
it can't
up the
up.
hill.
It can't back up.
Yeah, you can't
But-
get up the hill.
But at the switch, and supposedly they just missed the switch. Supposedly at the switch, there's a salvage process engine waiting there that could have backed up. There's also people at the switch who could who realized the freight trolley missed its switch off and could have alerted the trolley. Nobody does anything. But then, they're trying to claim, well, we tried to get a flag out. It took a long time to climb over the limestone car, and then I couldn't get over the coal car. Well, it doesn't really make sense. And one guy in the trolley says, and he worked at the factory, says, "I think they put that car there on purpose to keep the trolley from going down." And it's possible because they were making poison gas, and it's all conjecture at this point. It's possible they had a poison gas leak, and they put the car there to roadblock it. They had no other way of stopping it in a hurry. Well, it stopped it in a hurry. This is the trolley, and this is a steel car, and this is the end of the freight car. And you can't really get a good view of it until you see this. This was the trolley car. This supposedly was the trolley car. And at this point, this is where the conductor was standing when he hit. And he lives, it's a miracle, but he lives for 2 days and he dies. Well, lo and behold, he's dead. He's probably the best witness because he's up front. But he's not there to testify at the inquest. So the company, testifies, the passengers testify, the men on the freight train really testify, they're sure they didn't create a problem. Well, in October, the same day they released the inquest on the 1918 split rock explosion, they say it was the motorman's fault. He was driving too fast. He caused the accident. Nothing about he had the right to be on the tracks. This train didn't, So it's like, why is he at fault for being where he should be, and the train didn't? But that's, he wasn't there. So, and you can see the number 66. And this is the interior of what the car looked like. And this was carrying full load, like I think it was 60 passengers. They were all thrown forward. Some of the men were trying to hold on to the door handles in the middle of the car. When the accident finally finished, they were there holding the door handles in their hands. It was that kind of an impact. 5 people ended up dying. 1, I think, was immediate. The other ones will die very soon afterwards. A lot of the wounded are carried out. Another trolley comes up from the city. They bring them out by trolley downtown and escort them to ambulances, and then they take them up to the Syracuse hospitals. And again, this is like Alney Point where the accident occurred. And Alney Point has one other claim to fame. Alney Point was, they call it Alney Point. There was a station right on Casson Road, a little way station only for a few people to sit in. Well, Alney Point gave the name to the only layer of limestone. That's where it came from. Elmwood, it was probably from Elmwood Park. But what happened is there actually was a SU geologist that was teaching at SU from 1907 to 1927. 1928, he becomes a state geologist. So all the names for limestone are Alney, Elmwood, and they use Alney because Split Rock was taken. They actually wanted to call it Split Rock layer. So they got Alney, they got Elmwood, Clark Reservation, Janesville, all the local areas got the names for this sedimentary rock. So it's nice when you have like an inside track, I guess. Just leaving that up, I really don't have any more slides. There are very few of the factories before it exploded. But just to give you an idea of production, TNT was not really the big concern that people think it was. It was actually, I'm going to end this pretty soon, it was actually producing only like 5% of the TNT in the United States. It produced 9 tons of TNT a day, which at the drying plant, the other feature of the drying plant was to mix it with ammonium nitrate to increase the volume. Ammonium nitrate would increase the volume from 9 tons to 15 tons, and it really didn't lose any effectiveness for the TNT. So TNT was in such demand, especially when World War I began, that was a benefit. Now this TNT plant apparently only produced explosives for the Navy, for sea mines, torpedoes. So it was, in a sense, in one way it's a big plant, but in another sense it's only producing 5% of the TNT. Now the picric acid factories, which are back here, are producing 25% of the picric acid in the United States during World War I. They actually produced 72 million pounds a year during the war. And before the war, we were selling it to our allies, as they called them. We also sold 72 million pounds. That's 49 tons a day, compared to the 9 tons of TNT. The other feature about picric acid, it was made from a chemical phenol, which comes out of the coal tar. 1 pound of phenol would make almost 2 pounds of picric acid. But for every pound of phenol, or every ton of phenol, you created 6 tons of solid waste, which was like a gypsum material. So they're producing 49 tons of picric acid a day. They're also producing 169 tons of solid waste. That waste went to the dumps where the State Fair parking is, where the amphitheater is now. That's where they took them. So in total, for the 4 years they ran the picric acid factory, it comes out to 249,857 tons of solid waste went to those dumps. That's just from the phenol production. You also have TNT, which they're trying to recover as much as they can through the acid recovery. But what's also happening, and the one confusion is how did they get the waste out of there? Excuse me, I'm starting to lose my voice. This trolley line was bogged down with chemicals coming in, so they had to get the waste out somehow. Solid waste was not explosive. They actually could have taken it by train through Syracuse. That's a possibility. But the other feature is there used to be a bucket line that ran from the stone crusher, which the foundation was right by the TNT factory. It ran right through Onondaga Road up to salvage process. And there's records of 1911 when they closed the quarries on December 31st, they were taking down the quarry line. But in 1922 is officially when they abandoned the quarry, the cable road as they called it. Excuse me. I mean to cough into the microphone. So 1922, they're taking, actually is when they're taking down the cable road because of the recent closing at Split Rock. Well, the recent closing at Split Rock is the explosive factory. So apparently, some part or all of that quarry line was probably carrying out the solid waste to the waste beds because that's where the end of the quarry line was. So they could have shortened a bit, or they could have run trains out to Milton and then carried it over into the waste beds. But from reading the newspapers, when they officially ended the cable road, it was because of the closing of Split Rock in World War I, not the quarry. So that's another confusion of what was going on up there.
Rich, would some of that have been transported through the tunnel when the tunnel was built?
Well, yeah, the tunnel was there.
Okay, that's the
But
sense.
yeah, it would have gone through the tunnel, or it's more, I mean, they're transporting 15 tons a day of TNT by wagon. Now you've got 149 tons of picric acid waste. It's kind of like with the artificial gypsum. You know it because you see it at the waste beds. That's more than anything they could handle. I mean, they're pulling in 40 tank cars a day up the trolley line. They have as much as they can do, and they're running late. That's why the trolley accident happens at 7 o'clock in the morning. So they had to have another means out there. There's not enough wagons in the world to carry that much out during the day. They're carrying 15 tons of TNT out. That's like their maximum. But also, in addition to the solid waste, after it went through acid recovery, you'll find a series of trenches down here. It crosses the trolley line. It's nicely contained in a nice ceramic trench. Once it gets across their property into the town of Camillus, they let it run wild down into Geddes Brook, which runs through the Fairmount Fair and into the lake. And that becomes a problem over in Fairmount Fair. Also what they call the Hospital for the Feeble-Minded Children, which is off Wilbur, or near the zoo. They were pumping each day of toxic waste, not water, toxic waste, 1 million gallons per day down Geddes Brook. That's a lot. Then they don't even measure the air pollution. All they talk about with air pollution is Split Rock. They could see it for miles because there was a great big yellow cloud over it all day long. So God knows what kind of air pollution that was. I'll end there. There's other things. I'll just add one other cute story. Split Rock closes sometime after World War I. The TNT factories never get rebuilt. Picric acid is running probably to the end of the war. This operation down here, this line doesn't get sold to about 1930. And it's not until 1921 they moved this operation up to Bridge Street in Solvay. So more than likely they were still running this operation all that time, because there's two things. They needed to put a patent on the process, because what happens during the explosion, their lab reports are destroyed, so they don't have the material to file for a patent. And also it's there's a whole story about why they have a patent. It's actually during wartime they're supposed to have a free open book on patents. Well, for some reason, because two chemists, one working for Salvage Process, one working for the Bureau of Mines, they oversaw the patents. Those two guys take this patent that's supposed to be open to all government firms. They go to Canada and patent it and become multimillionaires after the war. It's kind of unusual. And the other thing about Split Rock after the war, the last big disaster at Split Rock is actually up in Yellowstone. There's a fire and it burns down several of the huge warehouses of sodas used to make nitric acid. And one other thing I'll throw in quickly, after World War I, the factory closed it down, and they were adding on to the factory all the time. They actually sued the government for ending the war too soon. And The government witnesses said, that's right, I told them to build this extra picric acid factory, I told them to continue ammonia oxidation. Semisalve won the lawsuit, they won $333,004. Then the government turned around and says, you know, you're a wartime plant, and this was a private concern in World War I, you're a wartime plant, you never paid your war taxes. So when you pay the $450,000 you owe us, we'll pay on the settlement. I don't know anything after that.